See these two pilots in the cockpit? It's hour 5 of a 12-hour flight. The dinner service is coming up from the galley. 2 trays, 2 meals, 2 pilots. But look closer at what's on those trays. The captain is having the chicken. The first officer is having the pasta. Different meals. Completely different. And it's not because one of them prefers white meat and the other has a thing for Italian. It's not even a coincidence. It's a safety protocol. A rule followed by almost every major airline on Earth. And it exists because, once, a single cook with infected fingers poisoned 144 people on one flight. And if both pilots had eaten the same meal that day, a Boeing 747 with 364 people on board would have had no one left to fly it. The rule that pilots must eat different meals is not a law. The FAA does not mandate it. EFAA does not mandate it. No civil aviation authority on the planet has written it into regulation. And yet, walk into any airline's operations manual, Virgin Atlantic, Avianca, Aerolíneas Argentinas, Emirates, Qantas, and you will find it there, written into company policy, treated as non-negotiable as the pre-flight checklist. The reason traces back to a 1950s radio play that terrified the airline industry into action, a 1975 flight, where luck was the only thing standing between a routine landing and a catastrophe, and a 1982 flight from Lisbon to Boston, where 10 crew members, including the pilot, co-pilot, and flight engineer, all got sick from the same dessert. By the end of this video, you're going to understand why that tray of chicken and that tray of pasta represent one of the quietest, most effective safety systems in all of commercial aviation. Here's the part most people never think about. The idea that pilots could be incapacitated by food didn't originate from a real crash. It didn't originate from an accident report or a safety board recommendation. It originated from fiction. In 1956, a British-Canadian author named Arthur Haley, who would later write the bestsellers Airport and Hotel, sat down and wrote a television play in 9 days. It was called Flight into Danger. The premise was terrifyingly simple. A charter flight is en route from Winnipeg to Vancouver. Mid-flight, the cabin crew and most of the passengers, including both pilots, are struck down by severe food poisoning. The only person left who can fly the plane is a passenger, a former Second World War fighter pilot, who hasn't touched the controls of an aircraft in years. What follows is a tense, ground-guided emergency landing, where a man with outdated instincts and a voice on the radio have to save everyone on board. The play aired on Canadian television. Then the BBC picked it up. Then it was adapted into a feature film called 0 Hour in 1957. And then, and this is where the story bends in a strange direction, 0 Hour became the direct inspiration for the 1980 comedy Airplane, arguably the most famous aviation film ever made. The same premise, the same plot beats, even the same character names in some cases. The film that made millions of people laugh was a near shot-for-shot parody of a drama about pilots being incapacitated by bad food. But here's what happened between the TV play and the comedy. The airline industry watched Flight into Danger and didn't laugh. They took it very, very seriously. At the end of the original 1956 broadcast, an announcer actually came on screen and told viewers that this scenario could not happen in real life, because airlines had special rules to prevent it. The thing is, at the time, most of them didn't, but within a few years, they did. The play had exposed a vulnerability that was obvious once you saw it. 2 pilots, 1 galley, 1 catering load. If something was wrong with the food, both pilots could be affected simultaneously. So airlines began implementing an informal practice. The captain and first officer would eat different meals, not because a regulator told them to, because a television writer had shown them what could go wrong. But aviation engineering is rarely about common sense, and almost always about physics. And aviation safety is almost always about learning from events that came terrifyingly close to disaster. The informal practice of different pilot meals became hardened into airline policy because of one specific day, 3 February 1975. Japan Airlines Flight 351. No, that's not a typo. It's a different flight from the famous JAL 351 hijacking. Was a Boeing 747 charter carrying 344 passengers and 20 crew from Tokyo to Paris, with fuel stops in Anchorage and Copenhagen. Most of the passengers were Japanese Coca-Cola salesmen and their families who had won a trip to Paris. It should have been the flight of a lifetime. In Anchorage, a catering company called International In-Flight Catering, a subsidiary of Japan Airlines itself, loaded breakfast meals onto the aircraft. Ham omelets. About an hour after breakfast was served, as the plane approached Copenhagen, passengers began vomiting. Then more passengers. Then the flight attendants. Within a short period, 143 passengers and one flight attendant were extremely ill. Abdominal pain, vomiting, the works. All 144 of them were hospitalized when the plane landed in Copenhagen. 30 required intensive care. The investigation, led by the United States Public Health Service and the Alaska State Health Department, traced the source back to those ham omelets. Laboratory tests found Staphylococcus aureus, a bacterium that produces toxins so fast-acting that symptoms can appear within an hour of consumption. And the investigation uncovered a detail that makes your stomach turn. The Staphylococcus bacteria had been introduced into the food by a single cook at the Anchorage facility. A cook with infected fingers. Here's the one that really matters. The pilots didn't get sick. Not because they were immune, not because they had different catering, but because of a coincidence of timing. The pilots had boarded in Anchorage. It was their dinner time, not their breakfast time. Instead of the contaminated ham omelets, they chose steaks. Pure luck. If breakfast had lined up with their meal schedule, if they had eaten the same omelets as 144 other people on that aircraft, both pilots would have been incapacitated. A Boeing 747 at cruise altitude over the North Atlantic, full of sick passengers, with nobody at the controls. After Copenhagen, the rule hardened. Airlines looked at what nearly happened and decided, never again would they rely on luck. The practice of different pilot meals, which had been informal, optional, a nice-to-have, became embedded in airline operations manuals across the industry. It was no longer enough to hope the pilots ate something different. It had to be guaranteed. And then there's 1982. This is the one that proved the rule wasn't just theoretical. It was being tested in real time, over and over. August 1982. An overseas National Airways DC-8 is flying from Lisbon to Boston. About 35 minutes out of Boston, 10 crew members begin to feel violently ill. Not just passengers, crew, and not just any crew. The pilot, the co-pilot, and the flight engineer. All 3 flight deck crew members, sick at the same time. The flight landed safely at Logan Airport, barely. A spokesman for the Massachusetts Port Authority later told the New York Times what happened. The crew all eat different things, but the one thing they had in common was tapioca pudding. Let that sink in. The pilots ate different main meals, following the rule. But the one thing they shared, the dessert, was contaminated. And it still got them. The rule worked, but it had a loophole, and the loophole almost brought down a DC-8. Today, the rule has evolved. It's not just different main courses. At most airlines, pilots' meals come from entirely different preparation batches, sometimes from different kitchens. The meals are labeled not just chicken or pasta, but with the specific batch, preparation time, and source kitchen. If one batch is suspect, the airline can trace it back instantly. And the rule extends beyond the flight deck. On many airlines, the cabin crew are also split into meal groups, not always 2, sometimes 3 or 4, so that no single contaminated meal can incapacitate all the people responsible for passenger safety. Here's the reality. Between 2010 and 2014, the Australian Transport Safety Bureau recorded an average of 23 pilot incapacitation events per year. That's pilots becoming unable to perform their duties, fainting, seizures, severe illness. About 75% of those happened in high-capacity commercial operations. The leading cause was gastrointestinal illness, food poisoning. And yet, in the entire history of commercial aviation, there has never been a single case where both pilots on a multi-crew flight were simultaneously incapacitated by food poisoning. Not once. The rule of different meals has been, by any measure, a perfect success. And it keeps working. In 2016, A Boeing 737-800, flying from Spain to Denmark, had a first officer incapacitated mid-flight from a contaminated in-flight meal. The captain, who had eaten a different meal, landed the plane normally. In March 2026, on a passenger flight, a captain slumped unconscious at the controls from severe food poisoning. The co-pilot, different meal, different batch, took over and landed safely. Nobody injured. Nobody even knew until they read about it later. That's the point. The system is designed to make its own successes invisible. Here's the one that breaks people's brains a little. The pilot meal rule is not just two different dishes on two different trays. It's an entire parallel food safety system that operates behind the scenes at every major airline catering facility on Earth. Airline catering kitchens operate under something called HACCP, Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points, a food safety protocol originally developed for the NASA space program. Every ingredient is tracked from supplier to tray. Meals are prepared in bulk, rapidly chilled to below 5 degrees Celsius within 90 minutes of cooking, and stored under strict cold chain controls until they're reheated on board to at least 74 degrees Celsius, 165 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature at which most foodborne pathogens are killed. But here's the part most people never think about. Pilot meals are prepared separately from passenger meals. Not just different dishes, different preparation lines, different storage, different handling protocols. At a large airline catering center, LSG Sky Chefs, for example, which produces millions of meals a year, the crew meal section is physically segregated from the passenger meal lines. The staff preparing crew meals undergo additional food safety training. The ingredients are sourced from different batches. The meals are packed in different containers with different seals, and when a crew meal is loaded onto the aircraft, it is labeled and assigned. The captain's meal goes to a specific galley position. The first officer's meal goes to a different one. They are never interchangeable. If a catering error means both pilots get the same meal, many airlines require that one pilot decline and wait, or, on long flights, that additional meals be provided from a different service entirely. There's also a less visible layer. Many long-haul pilots bring their own food, not because they don't trust airline catering, although some don't, but because it's an additional layer of control. A pilot who eats a home-prepared meal and a co-pilot who eats the crew meal are about as far apart as you can get in terms of contamination vectors. This is not mandated. It's not in any manual, but it's common practice. And it's one more reason the system has never failed. And consider this. The rule predates almost every other modern aviation safety protocol you can name. It predates reinforced cockpit doors. It predates TCAS, the collision avoidance system. It predates EGGWs, the terrain warning system. It predates the widespread use of CRM, crew resource management. The idea that two pilots should never eat the same thing was one of the very first systemic safety interventions in commercial aviation, and it remains one of the most effective and least known. So next time you're on a flight and you picture the two pilots up front, maybe the captain is having the chicken, maybe the first officer is having the pasta, understand what you're actually looking at. You're looking at a safety system that started as fiction. A 1956 television writer imagined a scenario so terrifying that the airline industry voluntarily changed its practices before any regulator forced it to. Then, in 1975, that scenario nearly became real. 144 people poisoned by a single cook's infected fingers, saved only because the pilots happened to prefer steak over omelets. In 1982, 10 crew members on a DC-8 got sick from the same tapioca pudding. The pilots ate different mains, but the shared dessert was enough to show the loophole. The rule evolved. Batch tracking, separate preparation lines, different kitchens. Every time the system was tested, it learned. And the result? In the entire history of commercial aviation, not a single multi-crew flight has ever lost both pilots to food poisoning. Not one. In a world where aviation safety is measured in layers, where no single system is supposed to be the last line of defense, the different meal rule has been exactly that. A perfect, unbroken last line. Planes don't stay safe because of any one brilliant invention. They stay safe because of thousands of small, unglamorous, barely visible decisions made by people who learned from things that almost went wrong. The chicken and the pasta, the steak and the omelet, the pudding that almost changed everything. These are not menu choices. They are one of the quietest, most effective safety protocols ever designed, and almost nobody outside aviation knows it exists. If you learned something today, hit that subscribe button. We uncover the hidden systems and strange stories behind aviation, and the next one is already in the works. Drop a comment with the one thing about flying you've always been curious about, but never thought to ask. Is there a sound on a plane that makes no sense to you? A rule that seems arbitrary? A fact about aviation that seems too strange to be true? We read every comment, and we might just make it the next episode. Thanks for watching and welcome aboard Eureka Aviation. See you in the next one.